In many parts of the United States, people disappear every year without a trace. Some cases remain unsolved for decades, and sometimes the explanations behind those disappearances are far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. The following story was shared by a taxi driver from Tucson, Arizona. What happened to him one night during a routine pickup would become the most terrifying experience of his life. And to this day, the people responsible were never fully found. This is what he remembers.
This is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me in my life. My name is Daniel, and I'm a taxi driver in Tucson, Arizona. Most of my work comes from regular clients, people who already know me. They call me whenever they need a ride somewhere. Airport trips, grocery runs, late-night pickups, the usual. But every now and then, I get a request from someone new, a stranger. And that's exactly how this dark and twisted story began. One night, after a long day of work, I was finally heading home. It was already around midnight, and I was driving near downtown Tucson. At that hour, the streets were practically empty. Most businesses were closed, and the area looked dark and abandoned. I was only a few minutes from going home when suddenly I saw two men standing on the sidewalk signaling me to stop. For a moment, I thought about ignoring them. I was tired, and technically I was already done for the night. But the truth is, when you work as a taxi driver, sometimes you can't afford to say no. So I pulled over. The two men walked toward the car and got inside. Both of them were dressed completely in black. They looked fairly young, but it was hard to see their faces clearly. The street lights were dim, and the area was poorly lit. One of them leaned forward and asked if I could drive them to a place outside the city. I hesitated for a second. Then I said yes. They got into the back seat, and I started driving. Normally, I like to talk to my passengers, just small talk to make the ride more comfortable. But these two, they barely responded to anything I said. Every time I tried to start a conversation, they would answer with one or two words at most. What made it even stranger was that they didn't talk to each other either. The entire ride felt wrong. The silence inside that car slowly became uncomfortable. About halfway through the drive, one of the men suddenly received a phone call. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He was holding an old cell phone, one of those early Nokia models from the early 2000s. He answered the call. "Yeah, we're on our way." He paused, listening. Then he said something that immediately made my stomach tighten. "Don't start without us." Another pause. Then he added quietly, "Yeah, we brought one." And just like that, he ended the call. The car fell silent again. At that point, we were already leaving the city behind. The buildings disappeared, replaced by long, empty roads and darkness on both sides of the highway.
They were giving me directions because they didn't have an exact address. After a while, I asked them if we were close. One of them said we still had about 15 minutes left. Inside, I felt annoyed. They never mentioned the ride would take us this far outside the city. They only told me right before we got onto the highway. But by then, it was too late to turn back. Just then, my phone started ringing. It was my wife. She sounded worried and asked where I was. But before I could answer her, the man sitting behind me suddenly snatched the phone out of my hand, and without hesitation, he threw it out the window. I immediately shouted at him, asking what the hell he was doing. But before I could say anything else, I felt something cold near my neck. I looked down and saw that he had pulled out a knife. The blade was pointed directly at my throat. He said, "Relax. Just keep driving." In that moment, the fear I felt was indescribable. At first, I thought they wanted to rob me, maybe steal my money, maybe take the car, maybe even kidnap me. But none of those things came close to the terrible reality of what those men were actually planning. Trying to stay calm, I told them, "Okay, I'll do whatever you ask, just please don't hurt me. I have 2 daughters waiting for me at home." The man behind me responded coldly, "Shut up, just keep driving, and don't say another word." So I obeyed. I kept driving in silence for several minutes until one of them finally said, "Turn here." I slowed down and saw a narrow dirt road leading into the desert. There was nothing around us, just darkness and bushes stretching out in every direction. To be honest, by that point, I was already convinced I was going to die. Still, I turned onto the road and kept driving. After a few more minutes, we arrived at what looked like a large abandoned house. It had 3 floors, but the place looked completely destroyed. The walls were dirty and cracked. There were no doors, no windows, just empty openings. They told me to turn off the engine. I did. Then they ordered me to get out of the car and walk towards the house. I couldn't stop myself from asking them what they were planning to do to me. I told them I didn't have money, that my family barely survived with what I earned driving a taxi, but they didn't care. One of them told me to shut up if I didn't want to get cut with the knife. They pushed me inside the house and forced me to walk up the stairs. That walk was the most terrifying moment of my life. Inside the building was almost completely dark. At one point, I tripped on the stairs because I couldn't see where I was stepping. And there was a horrible smell inside the building, something rotten, something foul that filled the entire place. When we finally reached the 3rd floor, I realized we weren't alone. There was a group of people waiting there. Every single one of them was dressed in black. They wore long black cloaks, almost like robes. In the middle of the room, there was a small fire burning on the floor. The light from the flames illuminated the entire room. And that's when I heard it. Screaming. I looked down. On the floor, there were 3 other people tied up. Their hands and feet were bound tightly, and their mouths were covered with tape. They were crying, struggling, screaming desperately. Then I noticed something else. On the floor, someone had drawn a large symbol, a pentagram. And all 4 walls of the room were covered with symbols and phrases written in another language. That was all I managed to see. Because suddenly, one of the men hit me hard in the head. I collapsed onto the floor. I didn't lose consciousness completely, but everything felt distant and blurry. I could still hear them talking. I felt them tying my hands and feet, just like the other victims. Then I heard a voice. A man who sounded like he was in charge. He asked my kidnappers, "Is this the only one you brought?" They answered yes. They apologized, saying they couldn't manage to bring anyone else. At that moment, I was starting to drift out of consciousness. But suddenly someone slapped me across the face, hard. They needed me awake. Apparently, whatever they were planning required us to be conscious. Then the group formed a circle around us, and they began reciting what sounded like a prayer in another language. I started crying, because in that moment, I knew I was never going to see my family again. That was where my life would end. One by one, they pulled out knives. Then they began making small cuts on our bodies. They collected the blood with their hands and began smearing it across their faces, drawing strange shapes while continuing those disturbing chants. I was shaking uncontrollably. Next to me, a girl who had also been kidnapped suddenly lost consciousness. One of them tried to wake her. They shook her, slapped her, but she didn't respond. And since she was no longer useful to them, they threw her out the window. Just like that. Looking back now, she might have been the lucky one, because whatever they planned to do to the rest of us was much worse. After they finished smearing the blood across their faces, the entire room suddenly went silent. Then, from outside the house, we began hearing animal noises. All kinds of animals. Growls, screeches, howls. It was terrifying. But the people around us began laughing. They sounded excited because they knew something I didn't. Those weren't animals. It was whatever they had just summoned.
I wanted to faint, but I forced myself to stay conscious. We were on the 3rd floor, and I knew that if I passed out, they might throw me out the window too, and I had no chance of surviving that fall. Then suddenly, the noises outside stopped. Every member of the group grabbed sharp weapons and began walking toward us. The leader looked at the others and said calmly, "It's time." The people tied beside me began screaming, the kind of screams that still echo in my mind to this day. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But suddenly, one of the cult members shouted, "Wait, I see car lights." Everyone rushed toward the window. Then, I heard the sound of a truck approaching the house. The group grabbed their weapons and ran downstairs. It sounded like they were preparing to confront whoever had arrived. Then, I heard gunshots, loud, rapid. The people tied up beside me started screaming for help. With the little strength I had left, I started screaming too. Minutes later, I heard footsteps rushing up the stairs. Then, suddenly, 3 armed men entered the room. They were soldiers. They had been patrolling the area while searching for a criminal group, and by pure chance, they discovered the abandoned house. They were our miracle. They untied us and took us to the hospital. At that point, I finally lost consciousness. I didn't wake up until the next day. When I opened my eyes, my wife was sitting beside me. The moment I saw her, I started crying uncontrollably. I truly believed I would never see her again. There was also an investigator in the room. He asked me questions about the people who kidnapped me. He told me they had only managed to capture one of them. The others had escaped into the desert and disappeared. The man they captured refused to say anything. He even told them he would rather die than reveal anything about the sect. Apparently, they had some kind of blood pact. I told them everything that happened that night. They said they did everything they could to find the other members of that group, but they never found them. The man they arrested is still in prison today, serving his sentence, and even after all these years, he has never spoken a single word. Which means those people are still out there somewhere, hiding in the desert, kidnapping innocent people, performing their satanic rituals, and getting away with it because no one knows where they are. And the number of missing people keeps increasing every year. Thank you for listening to my story. It's a miracle that I'm still alive to tell it.